Good evening. I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the speaker program for Military and History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight, we're pleased to have Professor Christine Helliwell presenting Semut, Secret Australian Operation in World War II Borneo. Christine is an anthropologist and author, currently Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University in Canberra. She's been carrying out research on Borneo's Indigenous Dayak peoples for almost 40 years. Since 2014, she's been researching World War II in Borneo and has travelled extensively throughout Sarawak, interviewing elderly people who still remember the war. She's particularly interested in the special operations conducted in Borneo by the Services Reconnaissance Department, SRD, popularly known as Z Special Unit, and has interviewed most of their remaining Australian veterans. Also in 2014, she has been instrumental in organising a ceremony at the Australian War Memorial to honour SRD/Z Special Unit. And in 2018, she co-curated an exhibition at the Australian War Memorial about SRD operations in Borneo. Now, a little bit of process before Christine begins. She'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. I invite you to send your question via chat message anytime up to and including question time. You can do this by clicking the chat icon in the middle bottom of the Zoom panel. Address the question to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read your question out using your first name. Christine is happy to have your screens on, but remember that everyone can also see you if that's the case. Please make sure your microphones are switched off. By now, you should be on speaker view, and I invite Christine to speak.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Brent, for that very kind introduction. And I just want to say thank you as well to you and to Jason for doing all the work to organise this event. And hello to everybody. It's a great honour and a great pleasure to be here with you tonight to talk about my new book called Semut. Now, let me just share my screen with you because I'm going to show some slides as part of this presentation. And somewhere down here. Okay, is everyone getting that okay? Okay, now just before I start, just let me apologise for the way I look. I was due for a haircut on the first day of the Canberra lockdown 4 weeks ago, and I know that Brent thinks that we Karens are pathetic for complaining about being locked down for 4 weeks, but I didn't get my haircut, and as a result, my hair has gone rather feral. So I just must apologise at the very start for that. Okay, so what I'm going to do tonight is I'm first going to tell you a little bit about the book in general, just to give you some idea of what the whole thing is about. And then, because it's a very big book, it's over 500 pages, I'm going to focus in on one or two aspects of the book that I think you might find of particular interest. And along the way, I'll read some extracts from the book as well, if that's okay with you. Okay, so let's get started. Semut tells the story of a secret Australian military operation, Operation Semut, that took place on the Japanese-occupied island of Borneo in 1945, in the final months of World War II. For those of you who don't know where Borneo is, it's located not far to the east of Singapore, and in fact not too far northwest of Australia, and I've put a red circle around it on the map there. Borneo had been occupied by the Japanese in late 1941, early 1942, immediately before they took Singapore. But by late 1944, the Allies were formulating plans to invade Borneo and win it back from the Japanese. The Allied landings at Labuan on the northeast coast of Borneo were planned to take place in June 1945. And as part of this planning, the Allies decided to secretly insert groups of commandos, mostly Australians, into the remote jungled interior at the eastern end of Sarawak in advance of the invasion. And you can see Sarawak on this map of Borneo. It's on the northwestern part of the island. Not quite sure why this map's so blurry, apologies. And the first groups of commandos were to be inserted into the Columbia Plateau, which you can see at the very eastern edge of Sarawak there on the map. The secret commandos to be inserted into Sarawak were from the organisation called Special Operations Australia, also known as Z Special Unit. They were asked to provide intelligence that could be used to help plan the Australian invasion. But they were also tasked with recruiting locals, especially the island's jungle-dwelling indigenous Dayak peoples, to fight against the Japanese. My book, Semut, tells the story of the secret operation, or tells part of the story of the secret operation. The other part I'm carrying over to a second book. And what a remarkable story it is. The first groups of operatives were dropped by parachute directly into the island's rugged inland mountainous jungles. Most of them spoke no Dayak languages and had little idea of what they would find on the ground below. Most were very, very young Australians and had never been outside Australia before, let alone experienced jungles like those that then covered the island. It was the time of the White Australia policy, and few of the operatives had met Asian or Indigenous people before. And yet it was crucial that the operatives win the trust and support of the island's Indigenous Dayak peoples if the operation was to be in any way successful. To make matters worse, the operatives knew that Dayaks throughout Borneo had once been, and perhaps still were, headhunters. They were jumping into areas which had been largely beyond the reach of the pre-war European colonial administrations, and about which very little was known. Many of the Dayaks in these areas had never seen white people before, and it seemed entirely possible that some of these Dayak people still engaged in headhunting. It was also possible that the Japanese who occupied the island had reached these remote inland areas and established bases there. If that was the case, the operatives could well be parachuting directly down into Japanese camps where they would be taken prisoner by the Japanese. So the possible scenarios confronting these commandos about to jump into Borneo, into Sarawak, were not great. As one of the veterans of the operation, who I interviewed 70 years later, told me, he said, "It was like the frying pan in the fire. If the Japanese didn't get you, the Dayaks might." In the book, I tell the story from not only the point of view of the operatives who were jumping into Borneo, but also to some degree from the point of view of the indigenous Dayak peoples who inhabited the jungles and the ground below. As I've said, some Dayaks had never seen white faces before. Others were resentful about the previous white rulers of the island who had ruled before the Japanese came. Most Dayaks had never seen or heard aeroplanes before, had never seen parachutes. So the million-dollar question was, how would they respond to these strange white men jumping down from the sky? And of course, you'll need to read the book to find the complete answer to that question. But now, if you'll allow me, I'm going to read to you some passages from the early parts of the book. These passages will give you some sense of the operatives' arrival into the world of the Dayaks and of the meeting that took place between these two cultures. Okay, so I'm now reading directly from the book. 25 March 1945. It was late in the rainy season, close to harvesting time, when Kaling Langit first heard the sound, a deep reverberating roar coming from above the clouds that so often blanketed her valley high on Borneo's remote Columbia Plateau. It seemed to circle the valley, louder, softer, then louder again. The young Dayak woman was terrified. Could it be spirit beings? She grasped her younger sister's hand and ran for her home in the nearby longhouse. Early the next morning, the sound came again, thrumming far above, eerie in its back and forth resonance. But this time, as she looked skyward, Kaling Langit saw something emerge through the morning's low cloud. 70 years later, she described it to me as a white umbrella. The first was joined by more umbrellas drifting down towards the bright green paddy fields in which she stood. Kaling Langit was so frightened that she began to weep. Above the cloud, 24-year-old Jack Tredrea, a tailor in civilian life, was up from his seat in the gloomy belly of the aircraft that had transported his small party from the Philippines island of Mindoro. He was stretching, adjusting his parachute harness, doing a final mental check of his weaponry. Mostly, he was trying not to think of what might be waiting on the ground below. Japanese soldiers and a slow, agonizing death under torture. Headhunting Diax looking to decapitate him. His tongue found the latex covering of the cyanide capsule secreted in his cheek. Now he and his 3 companions were moving to the bomb bay out of which they would jump, Jack second in line behind the party leader. One of the Liberator crew joked to ease the tension. "Lovely day for a jungle picnic, boys." The man behind Jack tried for a cheeky retort, but his voice failed halfway through. As the bomb doors opened, Jack became aware of his heart's furious beating. He was sure that he could hear it above the throb of the aircraft engine. Then his party leader was gone, and the empty slide yawned in front. He thought fleetingly of his wife back in Adelaide, and he jumped. At Kaling Langit's longhouse, normally largely empty during the day as people went about their daily work, there was pandemonium as residents hurried in to report sightings of the white umbrellas. Some were fearful that they were connected with the new Japanese rulers who had recently established themselves in Sarawak, convincingly demonstrating their spiritual potency by so easily ousting the previous white regime. Although the Japanese had not made it as far inland as this longhouse, local Dayaks travelled regularly outside the valley and were aware of the Japanese reputation for mistreating local populations, including molesting women. It was agreed that if the arrivals should turn out to be Japanese, the women in the longhouse would run to the jungle and hide. However, most longhouse residents are of the view that the newcomers were spirit beings, their earlier presence in the area inscribed in many local landmarks. The longhouse head, WWII Borneo, was hopeful that they came in peace. Like most Dayaks, WWII Borneo was a pragmatic man. Accordingly, he decided on a sensible course of action. Several young men would be sent to look for the beings and invite them back to the longhouse, where they could be appropriately honoured with food and drink. Each young man took with him a small piece of white cloth, customarily used during spirit propitiation ceremonies, tied to the end of his long carved blowpipe. This would serve as a message of respect and welcome for the new arrivals. As they emerged through the cloud, the 4 men from the Liberator saw immediately below, to their relief, the soft ooze of a marsh. They fell in a series of splashes into deep brown mud that sobbed and swooshed at the least movement amid tussocks of rush and sedge. And all around them, shocking after the absolute silence of the clouds, that most distinctive of Borneo sounds, the ceaseless, deafening throb of cicadas. As they searched for their stores, there materialized suddenly, perched at the edge of the mud, a small brown-skinned man. He had long flowing black hair and wore a yellow bark loincloth. In his hand was a lengthy wooden blowpipe, and attached to its end was a piece of white fabric. Astonishingly, the Dayak symbol of welcome to spirit beings and the European symbol of peace and surrender coalesced in that one remarkable moment. In their relief, Barry and Bauer, that's 2 of the men who just dropped down, in their relief, Barry and Bauer leapt forward with cigarettes, and the shared smoke, that near universal ceremony of conciliation in those more innocent days, was soon underway. And that's the end of the extract. My book, Semut, traces the story of what happened to Jack Tredrea and the other operatives, outlining the astonishing jungles into which they were plunged and the Dayak communities and cultures they found themselves a part of. It tracks the story from the operatives' first contacts and negotiations with various Dayak groups, to the brutal guerrilla war that they, along with their Dayak allies, fought against the Japanese throughout the jungles of northern Borneo. It focuses primarily on the operations activities along two of Borneo's great rivers, the Baram and the Rejang, outlining the operation's steady advance down these rivers towards the coast. It is a truly astonishing story. So, how did I come to write this story? Well, I must confess, it's hard to think of a more unlikely author of a book about war than me. I am an anthropologist of Borneo. I've been carrying out research with Borneo's indigenous Dayak peoples since the 1980s, including living with them in their communities for months and even years at a time. I've been interested for some time in the impact of World War II on Dayak peoples. So around 8 years ago, I partnered with the Australian War Memorial for a joint research project on World War II in Borneo, focusing especially on Dayak responses to the war. In 2014, not long after this project had begun, I flew to Adelaide to interview Jack Tredrea. I knew little about Jack at the time, other than that he had taken part in a secret operation in Borneo in 1945. When I first met him at his home in Adelaide in 2014, Jack was 94 years old. A retired tailor with soft blue eyes and a shy smile, it was hard to imagine Jack having operated alone behind Japanese lines for months during the brutal Pacific War. But he had, and in fact, at war's end, he had received a military medal for his actions in Borneo. Fortunately for my purposes, even 70 years later, Jack's memories of the war were still crystal clear. By the end of that first interview, Jack and I were friends. He invited me back the next day to share fish and chips with him, an offer which, of course, I gratefully accepted since I love fish and chips. 18 months later, in February 2016, Jack and I together lobbied the Australian War Memorial to install a plaque in its ground honouring Jack's wartime unit, Special Operations Australia, popularly known as Z Special Unit. Like all Special Operations Australia personnel, Jack had signed secrecy provisions when he first joined the unit, forbidding him from speaking about his wartime activities to anyone. As a result, in many parts of Australia, there were no Special Operations Australia's veterans associations until the 1970s and 1980s. The organisation's resulting lack of visibility meant that it was one of the very few from World War II never to have been honoured with a dedicated plaque at the memorial. The Australian War Memorial quickly approved the installation of a plaque, and finally, on 1st of August 2016, after 70 years of waiting, around 20 aged veterans from Special Operations Australia, all now in their 90s, plus more than 1,000 family members, gathered together at the Australian War Memorial to honour and remember. And that's Jack on the left of this photo, unveiling the plaque, along with Melbourne Special Operations Australia veteran Jim Elwood, who is still alive, by the way, and still living in Melbourne. Some of you may know Jim. Some days after the ceremony, I received an email from a literary agent. Jack and I had done a number of television interviews together in the build-up to the ceremony, during which we discussed Jack's wartime activities. The agent had seen one of these interviews, and she had emailed to ask whether I would like to write a book about Jack's World War II operation for a popular audience. She was sure, she told me, that publishers would be interested. It was a breathtaking suggestion. I had been collecting material for a book about World War II in Borneo for some time, but as an academic anthropologist, the book I had planned was very different from the one now dangled before me. I spoke to Jack. There's never been a detailed book written about the whole of the operation, he said wistfully. But I had no need for that gentle prod. Within a day, I had decided. And so I, unlikeliest of popular military historians, an academic, and I must confess to you, although please don't hold it against me and please don't hold it against the book, I must confess an anti-war activist for much of my life, In spite of being an academic and an anti-war activist for much of my life, I nevertheless found myself writing a popular account about Operation Semut, a secret Allied operation in the heart of Borneo. There have been moments since when I have cursed that literary agent. Piecing the Semut story together has not been easy. Special Operations Australia's obsessive concern with secrecy meant that many of its official files were destroyed at the end of the war. Those that remained, including the organisation's official history, are mostly partisan or biased and full of errors. Even the maps that the operatives carried, many of which are still preserved today, were often wrong. I trembled for operatives trying to find their way by them. But the Semut story had its hooks into me. I ploughed through literally thousands of documents in Australian and British archives and scores of personal accounts, some published, most not, left by those who had taken part in the operation. I interviewed the operation's 3 remaining veterans, all of whom have since died. And in fact, I interviewed 2 of them, including Jack, a number of times. And I travelled for months through what are today the Malaysian states of Sarawak and Sabah in the north of Borneo, where most of the operation had taken place. During these travels, I conducted almost 120 interviews with local people, most of them Diax, who were alive during the war. And when I look at these photos now, the main thing that I see is the mosquito bites all over my ankles. This fieldwork was very challenging on a number of fronts. Travelling throughout remote Borneo, even today, can be grueling. The mud, the mosquitoes, the heat, the humidity, the seasonal incessant rain. It is a tough, tough environment to make one's way around in. And some of you tonight may have served in Borneo during confrontation, or on other occasions. So you'll know what I mean when I talk about the toughness of the environment. And the environment of Borneo seems to get tougher for every year that I get older. Oh dear. To make matters worse, Dayak communities sometimes up sticks and move for a variety of reasons. So on 2 occasions, I went to considerable effort to reach remote communities where I knew an important World War II event had taken place, only to discover when I got there that the community that had been there in 1945 was no longer there. I cannot tell you how frustrating this was. And it wasn't only the environment that was tough. There were many logistical challenges to be solved during the fieldwork. For instance, I was required to work across a large number of different Dayak languages, most of which I did not speak. This meant that I had to find interpreters much of the time when I moved from one community to another. Nevertheless, slowly, painfully, the incredible story of the operation came to life. As it did, unexpected details emerged. So let me tell you now about some of the important findings that I made, some of these unexpected details that I discovered during the research and that are discussed in the book. The first, and perhaps the most important of the points that emerged, was the absolutely key role played in the operation by Borneo's indigenous Dayak peoples. This is barely acknowledged in official reports, but it was reiterated in almost every operative personnel account that I was told that I read. Dayaks, at home in the rugged Borneo environment in a way that the operatives could never be, were the backbone and mainstay of the operation. And this is a slide of some Kenya Dayaks being given weapons training during the operation. Dayaks had lived in these jungles all their lives and fought their own intertribal wars in them. So it's hardly surprising that they were much more used to jungle warfare than the operatives were, and much more practiced in the techniques that this kind of warfare requires. Dayak warfare has rarely taken the form of conventional Western warfare, in which armies face off against one another in open displays of military might. That kind of warfare, conventional warfare, is useless in the close confines of a Borneo jungle. Instead, Dayak jungle warfare has always relied on the kinds of techniques usually associated with unconventional Western warfare. In other words, the techniques usually associated with special operations, like Semut. And as many of you will know, these are quite different from the techniques used during conventional warfare. During unconventional warfare, as on Operation Semut, you don't normally have the numbers of personnel and the amounts of firepower at your disposal that you have during conventional warfare. Instead, during unconventional warfare, during special operations, you are heavily reliant on stealth, on guile, on trickery. So you're heavily reliant on techniques such as ambush, on sudden rapid raids when the enemy is at its most vulnerable, on luring the enemy into a false sense of security or into a false move. And these are exactly the techniques that were used during Dayak intertribal jungle warfare. As a result, Diax had a sure grasp, much surer than the operatives, of the techniques necessary for the success of Operation Semut. Activities like secretly scouting and spying out the enemy, silently shadowing the enemy through often treacherous jungle terrain, lying unnoticed in ambush for them, setting traps for them, all of these kinds of activity were carried out on Operation Semut almost exclusively by Dayax. The white operatives, by their own admission, lacked the necessary skills, and they all told me this. So let me give you an example from the book. Now, the Japanese were well entrenched in a tiny town called Song, located on the Rejang River. Song was strategically important, and Semut III wanted to find a way to remove the Japanese from the town. However, there were many more Japanese in the town than there were Semut personnel. Furthermore, the Japanese in the town had good defences, so confronting them in open warfare was simply not an option. And although the RAAF had bombed and strafed the town on several occasions in an attempt to drive out the Japanese, these attacks had all been unsuccessful. The Japanese remained in place. Now, the reason why the RAAF raids had been unsuccessful was because the Japanese had built good air raid shelters on the edge of the town, close to the jungle. These shelters consisted of trenches, each holding 3 or 4 men, and each was covered with protective roofing. So as soon as the Japanese heard the drone of aircraft, they retreated into the shelters and remained safely there until the air raid was over. So this presented a bit of a quandary for the Semut leaders. What could they do to move the Japanese out of Song? Well, local Dayaks working around Song with a small party of Semut operatives immediately saw the answer to this question when they scouted out the town. And they asked, can an airstrike be organised to take place at a specific time on a specific day? If so, since the party knew where the Japanese air shelters were located, the Dayaks had already spied out the entire area and they knew where all of these air raid shelters were. Since they knew where the shelters were, it would be easy to pick off the Japanese as they emerged from the shelters at the end of the raid. So the Semut leader thought this was a great idea, and so an airstrike was duly organised for noon 2 days later. On the appointed day at around 10 in the morning, 3 operatives and a group of 9 Dayaks headed to the area where the shelters were located. The European operatives, who were hopeless at staying invisible and silent in these kinds of conditions, because the jungle was fairly sparse as you move into the town, they remained well back in denser jungle, while the Dayak members of the party positioned themselves at the very edge of the trees, close to the shelters, and they were very adept at staying out of sight. And they waited. And let me read you now a passage directly from the book about what happened during the Song raid. So this is taken directly from the book. Finally, at 12:30, they heard the drone of aircraft. The air raid siren sounded and the Japanese headed for their shelters. The planes appeared overhead and shot up the town. As they left, vapour trails drifting across the sky, the Dayak settled securely onto the roofs of the trenches, 3 to each trench. In the sudden silence after the raid, Japanese began to emerge from the shelters. As they did, the Dayaks fell on them from above. And I'm now about to read you a direct quote from the memoir of one of the operatives who was present at this raid, and this is what he wrote. Sensing something behind them, the Japanese soldiers turned to look, and I saw the horror in their faces. Most of them got their first hack on the neck before they could utter a sound. The rest just took off, screaming. To my amazement, 5 men from an adjacent shelter, not one of our targets, came over to see what was happening, just as the Dayaks had finished attending to their first lot of victims. The visitors screamed and turned to run, but only 2 of them made it. A Japanese soldier began organising an armed party to give chase, but too late. The raiders had already melted into the jungle. And that's the end of the extract from the book. Operatives, by their own unanimous admission, simply lacked the jungle skills to perform these kinds of activity. They knew that they couldn't, for instance, climb onto the roof of an air raid shelter without making a sound in the way that the Dayaks could. And this, as I say, is hardly surprising. The operatives came from a very different kind of environment. This meant that they were heavily reliant on Dayak jungle and warfare skills throughout the operation. In addition, Dayaks understood the weather, the terrain, the movements of the rivers, the local flora and fauna, knowledge that was critical to tactical and strategic planning. The operatives, again, had none of this local knowledge. As a result, Dayak leaders assumed a role at the very heart of operation planning. For operatives, on the other hand, everything in this world was alien. Dayaks looked very different from what they were used to for a start. Dayak culture and behaviours were very different from anything they had ever encountered before. Even really basic things like the food were strange and had to be adapted to. For instance, Dayaks lived on rice, which in those days they grew themselves in rice fields they carved out of the jungles. Even though many Dayaks today no longer grow their own rice, most still eat rice for breakfast, lunch and dinner, just as they did back in 1945. It's strange for us to imagine now, but most of the operatives, on the other hand, had never eaten rice before, except when it was cooked up into sort of gluey sweet puddings, which I remember being given as a child. So most of the operatives had no conception of rice as something that you could eat as a daily staple, as we eat, say, bread or potatoes. And many of them found the unvarying nature of the diet in Borneo, rice 3 times a day, very difficult to deal with. In fact, one wrote later that when he left Borneo at the end of the operation, he made a vow that he would never, ever, ever again eat rice. And he kept that vow for 30 years. Can you believe it? Yet, astonishingly, in spite of these differences, Dayaks and operatives found ways to deal with one another, as human beings usually do. One of the key elements here, reiterated to me by both Dayaks and operation veterans 70 years later, was a shared love of laughter and jokes. Most operative memoirs make reference to the Dayak sense of humour. Similarly, many Dayaks, in conversations with me 70 years later, pointed to exactly the same quality in the operatives. It might seem strange that a shared love of humour should be so important in creating alliances, but we already know just how important laughter can be in the creation of effective military partnerships. Countless tales of war have already shown us this, and I'm sure that many of you have already experienced this, just the importance of laughter in creating bonds with people firsthand. Let me tell you now about an interaction between Dayaks and operatives that occurred during the Semut campaign. This interaction illustrates very well the central role played by laughter in establishing relationships between operatives and Dayaks. So this story comes from very early in the operation, from a place called Long Aka, located at the top of the Baram River. Semut too had recently established its base there among the local Kenya Dayak people. So the story I'm about to tell you concerns Semut 2's two radio operators, Helliwell and Wali Pair. And this is a photo of all of the Semut operatives who were then at Longaka. Helliwell and Wali Pair are the gentlemen on the third and the fourth from the right in this photograph. They were the two radio operators. So the local Kenya Diax had built a radio hut for Pair and Helliwell at the edge of the jungle, a couple of 100 meters from the old fort where the operatives were staying. Pair and Helliwell spent hours in the hut every day, trying to transmit and receive radio messages, mostly unsuccessfully, which didn't improve their moods. Now, a group of young Kenya men liked to come and hang out with Helliwell and Pair at the radio hut each day. This group of Kenya would sit around and talk and smoke and laugh and just have a good time. But their chatter made it very difficult for Helliwell and Pair to hear any incoming radio transmissions. And they got very frustrated about this and repeatedly asked the group of young men to keep quiet, but they were ignored, adding to their sense of frustration. So Helliwell and Pair came up with a plan. One day they connected the spare hand generator to 2 lengths of copper aerial wire that they then wrapped around the handrail on the landing outside the radio hut. This was the same handrail that the group of young Kenya men liked to sit on or lean against as they smoked and chatted. And these young men wore only bark loincloths, which left their bare bottoms in contact with the copper aerial wire. And I'm sure that you can all see exactly where the story is going. And I'm now going to read you an extract from Helliwell's memoirs written 40 years later in the 1980s, in which he tells us about this incident. So this is directly from Helliwell's memoirs. So on this particular evening, when the noise level got too much, we changed to the other generator and we gave her a good solid whirl. The result was very effective, in fact, spectacular. Those Diax literally lifted off that rail like a flock of sparrows following a 12-gauge discharge. Now, it's difficult to see Helliwell and Pair's behaviour here as anything other than highly discourteous, directed as it was towards people who were, after all, their hosts and benefactors. In many parts of the world, including very likely in our own part of the world, it might well have sparked a dangerous situation, but not among the Kenya. And this is a directly taken from Helliwell's memoirs again. So this is Helliwell. When they realised what we had done to them, they laughed like hell. They were wonderful people with fantastic senses of humour. And they paid us back in the form of little balls of mud fired via their blowpipes into Wally's and my backs as we washed our only shirt in the Yaka River the next day. Big pea shooter effect and stung like hell. But we agreed that we had earned our treatment and they toned their chatter down while we were trying to receive inward signals from then on. The Dayak response here is one from which many of us might learn. It's a model in the use of laughter and play to achieve harmony. Okay, so the first discovery I made during the research was the immense contribution that Diax had made to the operation. They were, in fact, its backbone. Without them, the operation would have had absolutely no chance of succeeding. Another, and perhaps the most startling discovery I made during the research was that operatives had invited Diax to headhunt against Japanese. And more than just invited them to do so, operatives had in fact offered payment for Japanese heads as an incentive. So what was Dayak headhunting? I talk about this in some detail in the book because it was very important to the operation. While headhunting was an important religious ritual for some Dayak groups, it involved cutting off the head of one's enemy as part of warfare and taking their head home to be ritually honoured within one's own longhouse. Headhunting had been practiced for a long time by some, although by no means all, Borneo groups. However, it had been banned by European colonial regimes throughout Borneo for more than a century by the time World War II came around, including in the areas where Operation Semut took place. And indeed, it very likely contravened the Geneva Convention. Operation Semut leaders initially invited Diax to headhunt against Japanese as a means of enticing them to join the operation. However, they quickly realized that headhunting could be used as a powerful psychological weapon against the Japanese. Like Westerners, most Japanese are horrified at the idea of their bodies being buried without their heads. So the idea of losing their heads, of bodies being headless after death, was terrifying to them. And the Semut operatives very quickly realized this, and they turned it to their advantage. So after raids or ambushes, Semut parties would leave headless Japanese bodies where they could be found by their comrades. And for their comrades, this was obviously a deeply distressing sight. This was a highly effective strategy for demoralizing and terrorizing Japanese forces. It also meant that Japanese soldiers became terrified about going into the jungles because they believed them to be full of headhunting Dayaks. So the reintroduction of headhunting was a very effective strategy on a number of fronts. And as I say, I discuss this in some detail in the book. However, it also had tragic consequences, and I outline these in the book as well. I won't go into them now. You'll need to read the book to find out what they were. Another important detail revealed during my research, which is not mentioned in any other account of Operation Semut, was the British role in shaping the operation. Special Operations Australia was to a very significant degree under the control of its equivalent British organisation called Special Operations Executive. Almost all the senior command of Special Operations Australia were in fact British, not Australian, having been seconded from the British Special Operations Executive. Similarly, many of the officers who took part in Operation Semut were British. Most of the operation's other ranks, on the other hand, were Australian. British control over the planning of the operation shaped the operation's character quite profoundly. In particular, while on the surface, the operation's main objective was to help prepare the way for the Australian 9th Division landings at WWII, its secret objective, equally as important, was to pave the way for the immediate return of British rule in Sarawak once the Japanese had been defeated. The British government was worried about a growing independence movement in Sarawak. It wanted to stifle this movement at its source as soon as the Japanese were gone. So the operation was charged with immediately establishing lines of influence and effective government in areas recovered from the enemy. However, few of the Australian other ranks who took part in the operation were aware of this hidden objective. It's clear from their accounts that many of the Australians in fact felt resentment towards the British, including towards their own British commanding officers. So one wonders how these Australian operatives would have felt had they known that they were, in fact, contributing to a resumption of British colonial rule in Sarawak. This secret objective of paving the way for a rapid return to British rule had important consequences for other aspects of the Semut campaign as well, including its relationship with the invading 9th Australian Division. And I discuss these other consequences at some length in the book as well. We can only properly understand any military campaign by examining the political pressures brought to bear on its leaders. Operation Semut was no exception in this regard. It's always all about the politics, even today. And one of my military friends, who very kindly was reading drafts of this book for me as I was writing it, kept saying to me, "It's always all about the politics, Christine." Most Semut operatives were anxious in 1945 when asked whether they would be prepared to go to Borneo. They felt this anxiety not only because of the island's Japanese occupiers, although that was certainly part of it, but they also felt it because the name Borneo itself had for centuries conjured up fearful images in the popular Western imagination. Images of monstrous fetid jungles teeming with perilous wildlife and headhunting savages. To make matters worse, headhunting was described as a Dayak sport in a booklet distributed by the Australian military forces for use by Australian soldiers in Borneo during World War II. An accompanying cartoon in the booklet showed a near-naked, dark-skinned man with several white heads scattered around his feet, cheerfully slicing off the head of a khaki-clad white man. As a result of this reputation, all the operatives were anxious when invited to take part in the operation, and not surprisingly. Nevertheless, they bravely put aside their fears. They were all extraordinarily brave men, as you'll see when you read the book. And they went. For many, the jungles turned out to be even worse than imagined, haunting their nightmares for years to come. The book aims to convey something of how it felt to be in those jungles, their sounds and smells, their suffocating perennial dampness, their alien threatening flora and fauna, their shadows and shivers of light. And it aims to convey something of the terrors that the jungles invoked in young Australians accustomed to a more arid, more domesticated environment. The difficulties of travelling in those jungles and the fears that they provoked in their own right were bad enough. But these fears were intensified by the fact that the jungles potentially harboured Japanese, spectral companions on every jungle journey. All wars are cruel, but the war against the Japanese throughout the jungles of the Pacific, including in Borneo, was especially cruel. The Japanese loathed and despised the Allies, and the Allies, for their part, hated and feared the Japanese much more than they did the Germans. As a result, the level of savagery witnessed in the Pacific theatre was shocking, far worse than that seen in the European theatre, as a number of military historians have pointed out. Kill or be killed, no quarter, no surrender, take no prisoners, fight to the bitter end. These were all everyday expressions during the Pacific War. For the operatives of Semut, the jungles potentially harboured Japanese. As a result, jungle and Japanese, for many, emerged into a single hateful enemy, heightening the unrelenting sense of threat that the operatives felt while they were in those jungles. And as I noted earlier, many of the operatives had nightmares about the jungles for years after they returned home. My book, Semut, is different from all other accounts of the operation in this regard, and probably from most other accounts of the Pacific War. In it, the jungles are restored to their rightful place at the heart of operative experience. The same is true of the Diax. Operative memoirs are suffused with the strangeness of these people, beside whom they ate, slept, slogged their way across the terrain. With the physical appearance of the Dayak, their behaviour, their unimaginable jungle skills, their noisy cavernous longhouses. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that the success of Operation Semut depended almost entirely on operatives finding ways to adapt to Dayak behaviours and practices, to Dayak culture. Yet, just like the jungles in which they were so mesmerisingly at home, the Dayaks rarely appear in most previous accounts of the operation. As an anthropologist, it was important for me to convey something of the cultures and life worlds of the Dayaks, since they were so central to the operation. So the book also takes the reader into the lives of the Dayaks. It takes us into their extraordinary cavernous longhouses, as you can see in the picture here, many of which were vividly described in operative accounts. And here is a picture of a longhouse from within, from inside the gallery, just to give you some idea of what extraordinary, immense structures they were. Many of the operatives were just completely astonished by these structures. Operation Semut can only be fully understood by first knowing something about Borneo's Dayak peoples. Only then can we begin to understand the improbable partnerships that the operatives established with some Dayak groups. Only then, too, can we begin to understand many of the military actions that occurred during the Semut campaign. All of these things are described in much more detail in my book. Read it and enjoy it. Thank you. Now, do you want me to stop sharing my screen, Brent, Jason?
Yes.
Okay. Just trying to find it. There we go. Okay, there we go.
Okay, we're just waiting on Brent.
That's better. I'm unmuted.
You're mining.
I forgot to do that. Thank you, Christine. That was tremendous. And yes, please, no sharing. I've got 7 chat questions that those Dorothy Dixes won't be needed. So let me just ask a few questions. Some will be comments. So Tony asks, why did the Allied intelligence choose the Columbia Plateau as an insertion point for the commandos?
Okay, I mean, there were a range of reasons. The first reason was that it was very, very remote. So they obviously needed to go somewhere where they weren't going to be dropping the men directly into areas where the Japanese were. So they were looking for somewhere very remote. Now, the big problem was that most inland areas were covered with jungle, and the Columbia Plateau was an area that actually has grassland, wide areas of grassland, surrounded by mountains. So it was very remote. It was difficult actually to get a plane in there. So that they were the sort of main reasons why they decided to go for the Columbia Plateau. Okay,
thank you. Now, Graham asks, were the Dayaks rewarded individually or as a group for their assistance? Or in fact, were they rewarded at all?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Some Dayaks did receive individual commendations. So in fact, 2 of the main sort of Dayak leaders were both awarded NBEs. I was going to show you pictures of them, but then I decided I just had too many pictures. I would say that in total, probably around, I'd say around 30 to 40 Dayaks of the hundreds who took part in the operation received commendations. I mean, one of the points that I make in the book is that most Dayak names, the names of most Dayaks who took part in the operation, we don't know anymore. For many, the only names that we have are of those who received commendations. This varies from different parts of the operation. One part of the operation, Semut 1, we have a lot more names of the people who took part in the operation, of the locals who took part in the operation, than we do from other parts of the operation. So yes, the short answer is a few received commendations, but they were never commended as a group.
Well, and it sort of raises the question, were commendations of any actual value to them?
Yes, very, very, very important. And you actually see photographs from later in life of Dayaks, very proudly wearing the medals that they were given.
Okay. And when did headhunting eventually cease amongst the Dayak people? This is Mark asking that.
Okay, that's a really interesting question. It had formerly been banned by the European colonial regimes in the mid 1800s, but in fact, in some areas, including one of the areas where some of the Semut guys were going, headhunting had continued as late as 1935. 1936, and they were going in there 10 years later. And indeed, there were still cases of headhunting in the late 1930s, early 1940s. So it had officially been banned for a long, long time, but it hadn't really disappeared from some parts of Borneo. And as you'll see if you read the book, some groups particularly took it up again with great alacrity when they were offered the opportunity to do so.
Fiona asks, were there any local Chinese operatives in the groups as there were in Malaya operating beside this SOE in Yorong Asli?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the points I make at the very start of the book is that there were both Chinese and Malay guerrillas as well, working as part of the operation. There were more Dayaks than there were Chinese and Malays, but there were certainly Chinese and Malays. And I make clear that in this book, I'm only concentrating on the Dayaks. And I hope that someone else will write a book which looks at the Malay and the Chinese and other groups as well. There were sort of Eurasians, various other groups that took part in the operation as well. I hope someone else will write a book that looks at the contribution that those different groups made.
One of these is not really a question. I've noticed a couple of hands being raised. If you want questions asked, can you put them in the chat? Type them into the chat, please. It's pretty hard to do with speaking. Jill asks, after saying thank you, Christine, was there much interaction between the Japanese and the Dayak, and what motivation was there for the Dayaks to help the Australians?
Yeah, really, really good question. Yes, there was a lot of interaction between Japanese and Dayaks, especially obviously in areas that were closer to the coast, which is where most of the Japanese were located. But Japanese were coming upriver, because most of the Dayaks were living in inland areas up the rivers. Japanese were coming upriver to basically get food, to take rice from the Dayaks and, chooks and pigs and other kinds of food that they needed. So there were, and it sort of varied throughout this part of Borneo. In some areas, there were where Dayaks were living closer to the coast or where Japanese had moved further inland, there were lots of interactions. In other areas, the Dayaks didn't see the Japanese at all. As the war went on, you're probably aware, some of you, that the Allies actually created a naval blockade around Borneo, and this made it impossible for Japanese to get food, to get supplies in. So Japanese started to become seriously short of food. And so as the war went on through 1944 and into 1945, they started to more and more just take food from Dayak communities and started to treat Dayak peoples with great cruelty, in fact, taking their food. Dayaks themselves then were starving, didn't have food. So as the war went on, the way the Japanese began to behave towards the Dayaks, the fact that the Dayaks were then running out of food, meant that they began to turn implacably against the Japanese. At the start, I don't think the Dayaks had really minded too much. I mean, it was just another external government and another bunch of people from outside who had come to govern them. So I don't think they had worried too much about the switch of government from the European regimes to the Japanese. But as the war went on, Japanese behaviour became worse. They began to move more and more against the Japanese. And this was very lucky for the Semut operatives when they went in. And
John asks, do you know what the kill ratio of Japanese versus the locals and commandos was? I guess this is after they started a concerted effort.
Do we know what was, sorry?
The kill ratio, Japanese to the locals?
I don't know, I'm sorry. Don't have any idea.
Was there any sense, when you were talking to the Dayaks, that many of them were killed by the Japanese as part of the operations?
Oh, I see. Some were killed, but no. Again, because the Dayaks were living inland, they suffered less than, say, Chinese and Malays who were living closer to the coast. So Chinese especially, there were many Chinese who were killed by the Japanese, numbers of Malays. There were some Dayaks killed, but not a huge number because they were just too far away, most of them, to really be as badly affected by the Japanese.
I think the question was when they actually physically engaged in war with the Japanese, who came off? Were the more Japanese killed or more Dayaks, I suppose, is the...
Oh, you mean one... Sorry.
Once they were actively fighting them.
I see. Oh, there were a lot more Japanese killed. You'll have to read the book to find out.
Okay.
There are a lot more Japanese killed, yes.
There was a great thanks. Ian Lilly says, a great talk, thanks, Christine. He's met only one Z Special operative. Do you know how many people served in Z Special or SOA during the war?
My understanding is that it was around 1,700 or so. Not all of those were on active service. So the number of people who are actually, recruited to the organisation, because I remember when we were, we were trying to organise the ceremony for them, and it was very hard to get accurate figures, but we figured from memory that it was somewhere around 1,700, and quite a lot less of those saw actual service.
Okay.
Fred, can you just give me 1 minute? Sorry, I've just run out of water and I just want to fill my water cup. My mouth.
Certainly.
1 second, sorry.
Anyone want to fill their glasses? Well, yeah, some of us can only.
Brent, my friend Deborah, who is on screen with us, has heritage in that part of the world, and her grandfather received a gong. I think you can see maybe her feed in the chat.
Yes. Deborah is just, that was the one, hang on, Now I'm losing track of it.
Sorry, apologies everyone for running out like that. I was getting very dry in the mouth.
So where was I? Did I?
We just answered the one about the Japanese, the kill ratios.
Okay, and I was going to ask, we were asking about how many people were on SOA.
Oh yes, sorry, you just asked that. Yeah, sorry.
Did you answer that?
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
Yep.
well done. There's an issue of, there was one of the people here, Jill Baird, knows an operative from Semut 4. Have you dealt with Semut 4 in the book, or was that later?
No, that's the second book. So I should actually just clarify for people. So this book looks at the planning of the operation, the start of the operation, the division into 3 different sub-operations, Semut 1, 2, and 3. And then most of the book is concerned with Semut 2 and Semut 3. The second book then will look at Semut 1 and Semut 4, which was a later operation. It was added in later on. So
Okay.
this one is about Semut 2 and Semut 3.
Someone seems to know the statistics. Semut killed 1,000 Japanese. None of its 42 Europeans died, but a small number of locals were killed in the operation. Are any of the operatives left?
No, the last one died last year. That was Bill Byers, who again just lived just on the outskirts of Melbourne, down in Mornington Peninsula there.
Okay, and one question.
Aged 100 when he died.
At 100, yeah, good innings. Was there anything special about the operatives and the way they were recruited? Were they special people, or they just happened to be young and willing to go?
No, they recruited a special breed, and amusingly enough, they were normally men, because all of those who saw sort of active service with SOA were men. They were normally men who were viewed as rule breakers. So often when they'd done something bad, broken the rules in some way, while they were sort of locked up, going through their punishment, they would be approached by some gentleman who would say, "Now, I'm just wondering if you're interested in joining, an organisation that carries out special activities." So they wanted men who broke the rules, who were not confined by rules, who had initiative, who were adventurous, who were individualistic. And of course, this has its good points and its bad points, and I discuss some of those. You can see in the book some of the not such good points that come out when you have that kind of temperament. It means you're less likely to follow rules, for instance, and that can be a problem in certain kinds of contexts. Sorry, that was slightly going.
No, that's right. I'm just trying to understand what Jason's saying to me.
There are some comments there by someone who has some ancestry in the Dayak community, and they might be worth relating to Christine.
Now?
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
That's Deborah.
That's
well,
Deborah J, yeah.
That's me. So my grandfather was a tracker. He was a tracker during the war. So he was actually a leader, like a Tumangong, at a young age, because his older brother was killed by the Japanese. So then he got, unfortunately, he got the job. He was the last remaining boy, so he was Tumangong. So he was quite young when all this happened. I don't know if you know Derek Freeman.
I do. Yeah. Well, I mean, he died many years ago. But
yeah, he lived with on my father's side with Tumangong Ko, which is my father's great-grandfather. So he's another anthropologist.
You'll have to read the book, because there's quite a lot.
Absolutely. It's quite
a lot about Tumangong Ko in the book, and in fact, there's a photo of him in the book.
Yeah. So you were talking about living with the locals. So Derek Freeman, a long time ago, he lived in the longhouse with my father's great grandfather. But the Japanese War, I think it was a testament of the Australian, what's the word, the humorous side.
Yes.
That really endeared them to a lot of the locals.
Yes.
So they were not, they weren't stuffy, and that's something that you speak to anybody and they will always tell you they were really good top blokes.
Yes,
Really,
yeah. And what they would say is that they weren't sombong in the way that the
they're not. Yeah, they weren't.
The pre-war administrators had been.
Absolutely, not like I don't know if I should say this, but not like the English. The Australians were different. They were down to earth. They got down and dirty. They sat on the floor and ate with hands and stuff like that. They weren't. So they were really easy to get along with. Unlike somebody asked what's in it for them. The Japanese were quite different. So they ruled with an iron fist. So nobody liked that. So what was in it for them is just they were treated quite terribly. Yeah.
So your ancestry is Iban.
Yes, so Dayak or Sea Dayak or headhunter, but I think I mentioned that the headhunting wasn't done randomly. It was more a case of fighting among clans, right? So they were a warring tribe with the upriver. The Kayans were the biggest foe. They hated them.
Yeah.
The Ibans and Kayans, and they fight among each other and headhunt only when they fought each other.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for that.
No worries.
And I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you very, very much, Christine.
Thank you.
That's tremendous. It's a very large book, and it's published by a very reputable publisher, Penguin, and it's all available in the bookshops now.
Here it is, in case you haven't seen it. It is a big book. It's a good doorstop, as one of my friends said.
So just a little bit of extra other business. Next couple of days, we'll be sending out another 3-minute feedback survey. Thank you to everyone who filled out last survey, and I hope you do it again. We take notice. The next speaker will be myself. I've been working for some years on understanding and documenting the military record of Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey. And my presentation is titled Leadership in Crisis, Blamey at War. And that'll be presented on Wednesday, the 10th of November at 7 p.m. on Zoom. And there'll be information coming out, much more information coming out than it's appropriate to talk about now. There's some bad news. We had a one-day conference planned for later this year. It's had to be delayed because of COVID. That is the title is The Bloody Beachheads, the Battles of Gona, Buna and Sandananda. Postponed again. Sometime I hope we actually get to do this. It's been pushed out to Saturday the 12th of November 2022 to coincide with the 80th anniversary. And lastly, this brings this evening's sessions to a close. Thank you again, Christine. Thanks also to Jason, who keeps us going behind the scenes, and thank you all for joining us.
Yes, and thank you all very much for coming along and listening. Yeah, thank you.